from the campus of the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. This is Mastering Innovation on Business Radio, Sirius XM 111.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to Mastering Innovation, our show here on Sirius XM's Business Radio, powered by the Wharton School. I'm your host, Nikolai Zygulko, Professor of Management and Co-Director of the MEC Institute for Innovation Management. I'm joined by my co-host, Harbir Singh, also Professor of Management and Co-Director of the MEC Institute. Just a reminder, we're live every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and the show replays a few times throughout the week. If you have any comments or questions during today's show, please give us a call. The phone lines are open at 1-844-WHARTON. That's 1-844-942-7866. Now, we're having a very interesting show today. We'll be spending this hour with three of our colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania who've just published a book called Managing Discovery in the Life Sciences, Harnessing Creativity to Drive Biomedical Innovation. So this book is both about the science and the management behind biomedical innovations. Now, what makes your book really so interesting, at least sort of in my view, is that you're really taking a broad perspective, right, on the innovation problem. Your book examines the interplay of scientists, managers, investors, and regulators kind of involved in this process of discovering new drugs and medical devices. Now, I guess in part this sort of almost reflects the diversity of the authors, right? We have a biology professor, we have a management professor who was trained as a sociologist, and we have a management professor who was trained as an economist. And so for the whole hour here, we have Phil Ray. He's a professor of biology and also the director of the Life Sciences and Management program at the University of Pennsylvania. Right now in the studio, we also are joined by Rob Burns, a professor of healthcare management. And then in the second half of the show, the third member of the team, Mark Powley, a professor of healthcare management at Wharton, will also join us. So for now, we're getting this conversation started with Phil and Robert. So thank you, first of all, so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yeah, our pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Great. So maybe let's start with the simple question of how did the three of you decide to write this book? Maybe Phil, you're going to start us off.
Yeah, I mean, really there were two phases to it. Way back 2012, Mark and I were having a meal in Penna, in the restaurant, and we were reflecting on some of the material that we were sharing with the students, and I was also reflecting on some writing I'd done for American Scientists, where I'd been digging deep into various stories, examples being the statin story and the ivermectin story, which incidentally isn't in the book, but nevertheless it's a gripping story. And it occurred to us that maybe we should combine forces, given that pedagogically we'd been engaged in communicating the economics and the management matters, and that was something that Mark was the guy for. And I was communicating the science that was relevant to those management issues. And I think then, several years later, when Mark stepped down from the directorship of the program, he said, well, if we're going to do anything about this, we better do it now. And that's, I think, when Mark decided that it was a good time to memorialize the pedagogical activities that we've been engaged in. And we felt that we were in an even more unique position because we not only had Mark, who is a healthcare economist, in play, myself, I'm a biochemist, but you also had Rob Burns, who had joined leadership of the program. He'd come on as a co-director, and he was a sociologist who was really supremely interested in the healthcare ecosystem.
Yeah, great. Rob?
Well, you know, the genesis of this book ties back to this program, and this, you know, Penn's a unique place with all these multidisciplinary majors and things like that. And Penn integrates knowledge, you know, President Gutman's initiative. But this is a program where we're actually integrating knowledge from multiple disciplines and training undergraduates in dual degrees in biology and business. We're the only university in the world who's doing that. And this is perhaps the only school where you could do that because they have an undergraduate business school.
Yeah.
Then you have a phenomenal science program. You have all the wonderful discoveries coming out of the Penn Health System and the companies they're spinning off. And so we have this unique lab here at University of Pennsylvania where all these different faculty from all these different disciplines are basically 2 blocks apart.
Yeah.
And so it fosters the interaction among everybody. Then you have the university putting these dual degree programs together. You have Roy Vagelos funding this dual degree program in life sciences and management. And then you bring together faculty you otherwise would never meet. So Phil's the only biochemist I know.
Yeah.
And then he's the only but I teach a core introductory course with him, and so I've been learning science on the fly for the last 5 years, sitting in class with Phil, and conversely, he's learning management and sociology for me. And this is a unique place where the faculty are learning on the fly, just as the students are learning. And so we have this lab, and this book just sort of flows out of this Penn environment.
Great. So the book is about biomedical innovation, and now you open up a newspaper, and most likely you'll find a line something like, "The big pharma model is broken," right? So everyone is talking about that. And you have a very nuanced answer to that question. So can you tell us a little bit about what's your response to someone saying, big pharma model is broken?
Well, I don't want to steal Mark's thunder. No. He's coming out in the second half, and he wrote the chapter. But I think I can paraphrase it, and I'll let him elaborate further. And that is, big pharma model is not broken. It's basically been in a steady state for the last 50 years. What's happening, though, is we're spending more money on the R&D and not getting any extra output for it. But we're not getting any worse output for it either. So it's a question of efficiency, not productivity, in terms of the number of new molecules coming to the market. And Mark's chapter goes through the incentives were put in place because of insurance reimbursement and the fact that drug companies knew that they were going to get reimbursed for their drugs, even if they weren't the top of the line, best in class thing. And so they had an incentive to come up with lesser quality molecules and bring them to market, and then those things don't necessarily sell well. They may not even get approved, maybe increased productivity. And so the incentives were put in place by the insurance system. So I think that would be Mark's argument. But in terms of productivity, it's been a flat liner, for the last 40, 50 years. And every year in our class, we go through the latest statistics to see if there's an uptick or a downturn. And it varies year by year. Right now, there's like a 2-year uptick, but nobody's sure if that's going to persist.
Yeah. So since we're at the university here, and universities also play a role kind of in this drug discovery process, let's talk maybe a little bit about sort of the non-for-profit actors in this space, because clearly we have a lot of time to talk about firms, but maybe let's start there, because if big pharma is broken or not, kind of who else could step in, right? And so we have universities, we have government agencies like the NIH, and of course we have like the Gates Foundation, right? That again got lots of press for what they're doing. So how do you see this playing out in this ecosystem, as you were just mentioning this? What's kind of the role of these other players?
Well, I think what's happening now in biopharma R&D is that the universities and the research institutes are playing a much bigger role, and that's because we're having more of a distributed R&D model, open innovation model, and a lot of the basic science and some of the applied science being done in the universities. So Penn is an obvious example. We have 2 new products coming out of here. And spin-off companies. So increasingly, you can't rely on the pharmaceutical industry itself, and they know this. And so they're trying to increase their reach into the universities, their alliances with universities. We had a huge alliance with Novartis. But I think that's the model going forward. So these nonprofit actors like universities, research institutes will play an increasingly bigger role.
Yeah, I'd endorse that. And I think I'd go on still further, and I would say that the period of the small molecule is sort of petering out by and large, not entirely. We have the Gleevec story, which is a marvelous example of a small molecule that's been of incredible therapeutic impact for CML, chronic myeloid leukemia, and such like. But I think we're going more down the sophisticated molecular cellular route, and I think as a result of that, it's the real sharp end fundamental research that's spawning new innovation to a much greater extent than it did in previous years. And so the necessity of entities, universities, NIH, Gates Foundation, etc., is, I would say, ever more prominent because of the need of investigators that are almost exclusively focused on addressing fundamental basic science issues, and out of those spin some fundamental therapeutics without necessarily having the objective of development of a therapeutic in mind. I think, as you probably gathered from this book, a major play in the book is serendipity, and that is getting answers to questions that were never posed, but answers that turn out to be of incredible therapeutic value.
So tell us more about serendipity and innovation. I mean, one of the interesting things is companies spend a lot of money on R&D. They have big teams and labs and research programs. And you actually talk about the unintended, the branches that people never thought about, that those actually worked. And so that one is the role of serendipity. The other one is, can you actually manage innovation?
Do you want to start with that, Rob?
Well, the serendipity part is first, you're doing experiments. You have a hypothesis in mind. You're looking for some expected findings, and then they don't turn out. The question is, what happens then? And what we found in these case studies is that part of the serendipity is just recognizing that there was some serendipity. Say, those were some unusual findings which I didn't expect. What do those mean? And then they pursue a new line of, inquiry or investigation, which leads to some really fundamental discoveries. The other thing I'd mention about in terms of managing innovation is that, it gives credence to the things that academics always say to their deans and the presidents. We need more time, we need more research funding, we need more students. And there's something to be said for having a lot of what we call corporate slack to finance, open investigation, open inquiry into things, because that's what we see in a number of these case studies. They weren't necessarily richly funded, but they required time. They required the cooperation and collaboration with investigators all over the world. It required money. And oftentimes that's what it takes to pull these things off. It's not something you can engineer and just do top down. A lot of this stuff is bottom up, individual investigators driven by a passion, driven by curiosity, with a hypothesis that's unusual and pursuing it even in the face of doubting Thomases.
I think something that's really relevant is the Life Science and Management Program itself. So I would say the imperative for that program, which essentially is the brainchild of Roy Vagelos, who is a chemist who, as you all know, became the CEO and president of Merck. And I think the thing that the LSM program is about is the objective of it, if it has an objective, is to put people in positions of responsibility with respect to the allocation and distribution of resources, who have a sufficiently nuanced understanding of the science to identify a nascent proposition in the scientific sector without losing the potential significance of that finding in translation. And I think a major play into that in several chapters in the book is an appreciation that some of the best leadership, when creativity is the key determinant, not productivity, some of the best leadership often comes from individuals that have a very, very deep understanding of science. They came out of science themselves, and then they acquitted themselves of the requisite skills in order to administer science, if you will, and make calls on which projects to carry forward, which ones maybe are long-term objective projects, and which projects are maybe shorter term but could provide funds to support the longer-term projects.
Yeah, just to tie this into some academia, I mean, you're both in corporate strategy. I recall the corporate strategy literature saying that, at least one stream of it saying that the key to strategy is resource allocation. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily the people at the top, but the people controlling the budgets down below and where they allocate the finite resources, and being willing to seed and continue seeding programs that may not necessarily be paying off. We see that in a number of the case studies here.
I think what you just said about that's by the way, that other point you made was fascinating about really knowing the technology and the science, because otherwise, you start misallocating resources. But I think what's very interesting in what you said, Rob, was the point about slack. And these days, it's very much in fashion to be lean and mean. That let's release cash flow. Let's scale down facilities. I think you're making a different case.
Well, it can go both ways. I mean, there's some case studies in the book where people came up with discoveries basically experimenting at their kitchen table over wine and cheese, using off-the-shelf parts that weren't made for these kinds of experiments, just basically developing prototypes from scratch, tinkering in their garage. So some people have done it lean. But I think if we're talking about the biopharma industry, they're not necessarily going to get away with doing this in a garage. I mean, it's going to really take a significant allocation of capital to see more discoveries go through, especially if it's distributed across a larger ecosystem of players.
And time.
And time. And, one of the lessons from the book is that it's across time and across space.
Across space,
and so it's basically global.
Mm-hmm. So the other question that intrigued me was this idea of the interorganizational clusters, and the role of Cambridge and San Diego, and the three main elements there.
The triple helix.
The triple helix, yes, exactly. So tell us more about that.
Well, it's just 2 case studies, and so
Right.
you can't generalize from that. But everybody in the world wants to be like Kendall Square. Every day I pick up some reading where this city wants to be a medical hub, or this city wants to be a biotech cluster. We were teaching on China's healthcare system. They're trying to develop 4 of their large cities into biotech clusters, but their approach is basically top down. And it's not necessarily the case that they've bought into this triple helix or can replicate the triple helix. And that means you have a supportive local government, which is willing to, extend deals to entrepreneurs and startup companies so they'll co-locate there. And then you have a rich bed of scientific institutions. And you're not going to get much better than Harvard and MIT up in Boston. And then on top of that, you need private equity and venture capital. So that was the triple helix that we identified in Kendall Square and some of a little bit in San Diego. But, those are the necessary ingredients. Whether or not it's sufficient is a whole different question. There's a whole literature on these economic clusters that I'm not necessarily the master of. But that's one of the things we see, and at least these cities that other places are going to try to replicate. But I'm not sure you can replicate Harvard and MIT in the short term.
I think as someone who spends a lot of time teaching science, I think that the cluster effect, and it's incorporated into that chapter, that's very, very significant, I think, is that basic scientists who are primarily academics realize that there's some where their fundamental science can go, and there's gainful employment for really talented young scientists in biotech, for example. And I think that is a very, very significant play into the equation. And I think it's a very significant play into the equation, certainly in certain parts of the world, in the UK and Europe, for example, where funding for fundamental research is scarce and hard to obtain. And I think a model I often use when I'm teaching biochemistry is to point out that some of the fundamental discoveries that I'm describing, they were not actually done in universities. They were done at places like Genentech, or they were done by Shimadzu. Some of the most fundamental developments in proteomics came out of Shimadzu. A Nobel Prize came out of Shimadzu. Likewise, Genentech.
Another thing is, if you look at where these entrepreneurs come from and what the seed bed in which they grow, it's very interesting. We did a study with a colleague at Stanford on medical device entrepreneurs. They're mostly physicians, but almost all of them had a bent in engineering. Whether their father was an engineer, or they minored in engineering in college, or they double majored in engineering. And so they had this interest in tinkering with things, playing with their hands, making prototypes. And then they just happened to go to the right place, oftentimes Stanford or Duke, where they're surrounded by some other people who help them scale up this business, who provide the seed funding for it. And so I think you kind of have to look for the constellation of these different actors coming together in some very favorable seed beds for this stuff to germinate.
And I suppose the role of community, right? The community of scientists and venture capitalists.
Entrepreneurs in particular.
But you're surrounded by a lot of other people like you, and you're kind of feeding off them, and you're learning from them. They're helping you solve through these problems. And that could be both a local community as well as a global community.
For those of you just tuning in, you're listening to Mastering Innovation on Business Radio, powered by the Wharton School. I'm Nikolai Zigelko, and my co-host is Harbir Singh. We are speaking with Phil Ray and Rob Burns, two of the authors of the new book, Managing Discovery in the Life Sciences. Now, I think what really, to me, is sets this book apart is that you have these in-depth studies of individual diseases and kind of where different kind of solutions came from, and really fascinating stories around this. So let's maybe start with cardiovascular diseases, like the number one killer. And one of the key discoveries in this arena has been, of course, statins. And intriguingly, they were discovered in Japan by Akira Endo, who worked for Sankyo, a Japanese company, but they were not brought to market by them, but they were brought to market by Merck. So what were some of the lessons that we can draw from that particular case?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting story. So Akira Endo was originally trained as an agricultural biochemist, and he started his work actually on clarifying fruit juices, coming up with enzymes that clarify fruit juices. And I think the key play in that story, as you read in the book, is that he went and had a leave of absence for 2 years, really as a recognition of what he'd managed to accomplish as a young biochemist, and he went to New York City. And that's when he became cognizant of the scale of cardiovascular disease in the West. Cardiovascular disease was virtually unheard of in Japan at that time. And so then he went back to Japan and engaged in this huge number of screens of fungal filtrates for agents that interfere with ergosterol or cholesterol biosynthesis. And I think that what happened there was that, one, he was operating in Japan, and Sankyo did not have the awareness of the extent of cardiovascular disease at that time. They were in a condition in which cardiovascular disease was relatively rare. And at that point in time, no one had considered the possibility of the identification of therapeutic agents that could address the cholesterol matter, which came out of the Framingham study, which was something operated out of the United States of America. And I think, because it had never been done before, I think the thing that put the stalled that research program were the animal trials that sported a cellular histology that looked like a pre-cancer. As it turns out, that was not the case. It was more a manifestation of elaboration of a membrane system that's involved in cholesterol biosynthesis. It's a compensatory response to statin therapy. And Merck, at that time, were aware that Sankyo had a patent on statins, and they were investigating the statins. And I think in Merck's case, what was so wonderful is that the leadership of research at that time, the president of research at that time, was Roy Vagelos. And Roy Vagelos had trained as a cardiologist at Columbia. He had worked with very sick heart patients, and he had also spent the bulk of his career as a fundamental biochemist working on lipid metabolism. So he's perfectly positioned to understand this nascent technology and what its true significance might be. Mm-hmm. And as a result, Merck received a sample of the agent in question. It's called mevastatin, the very first statin to be discovered. And they started doing trials, and on the basis of those trials and on the basis of the sort of advice they were getting from some of the clinicians with whom they were interfacing, they realized that they were onto something that could be huge and of really profound significance. And I think it is that they realized that even if there were some off-target effects of the statins, which, as it turns out, is probably not the case, they felt that the benefit to individuals that would likely succumb to cardiovascular disease in their 30s or their 40s without some sort of therapeutic intervention was far outweighed that risk. And I think that was what seeded what eventually happened. And Merck carried the product forward, as you know, not mevastatin. They went forward with an alternate to mevastatin.
And so when you go forward in that, you see the story of Lipitor and
yes,
the Warner Lambert coming up with something that was very innovative, and then it's commercial, the most successful drug in history. Can you sort of talk about what are the lessons learned in that journey?
So, again, I mean, that's a wonderful example of serendipity. It was Warner Lambert that started the Lipitor cascade before they were bought by Pfizer. And that was thanks to the work of Bruce Roth, who was a very young postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan. And he was adept at tinkering around with organic chemicals. And he was the first guy to do an in vitro synthesis of a statin. He recapitulated the synthesis of mevastatin. And Warner Lambert got wind of that, and they hired Bruce Roth. And I think what then drove the development of the statins to eventually give rise to Lipitor with one or two byways was, I think, the recognition that if Lipitor, or atorvastatin, as it was called at the time, if that were to enter the market, it had to have a significant edge over pre-existent statins because it was the sixth statin to enter market. And I think that's when they pushed very, very hard with respect to cold organic synthetic technology, and were in a position in which they could preferentially resolve a particular isomeric form of atorvastatin and thereby double the efficacy of the agent, meaning that individuals could take far less of the therapeutic to get even more benefit than they would get from the statins that were currently on market. And I think that's what really sold the case.
You know, Phil's comments basically show you that you need to know the science as well as the business to see how these products and companies emerge.
Absolutely. So, Rob, you were involved in a chapter, I think, on balloon angioplasty.
Yes.
And I think that was partly the kitchen table innovation story,
yes.
right?
Very much so.
So most of the chapters are about drug discovery, and this was also sort of a chapter about medical devices, right? So what were some of the new insights that came from looking at medical devices?
Well, you know, I stumbled on that one. I was reading, as I was doing a study of all these medical device entrepreneurs, and I stumbled across someone who said that balloon angioplasty was one of the 10 most significant medical innovations of the 20th century. And I knew what it was, but I didn't really know how it came about, and I didn't fully appreciate why it was one of the 10 most. So what I did is I hired 3 MBAs, 2 of whom were cardiac surgeons, to help me go back and dig up all this information. And it just turned out to be one serendipity after another. And I think what was particularly interesting about this innovation is the fact that the pioneers were experimenting on themselves. And so they were basically cutting open their veins and inserting things into their veins to see how this stuff would work. And then they'd fashion not only their own catheters, but their own balloons at the end of these catheters using all kinds of wacky materials just to see if this stuff would work, come up with what we call proof of concept.
Yeah.
And so these were people who obviously believed in what they were doing because they were willing to risk their lives for it. And they're mavericks. That's basically, one of the things we teach about in innovation is sometimes it takes mavericks to pull things out. That's who these people were. And one of them actually got the Nobel Prize 20 years after being ridiculed for what he was doing. That's just how maverick some of these people are. So it's sort of a fascinating study. And then the guy Andres Grunseg, who's recognized as the pioneer, he was ridiculed by almost all of his colleagues. And it took a couple innovation champions, as we talk about, people who are superior in the hierarchy, who recognize that he may be onto something, to support him, to protect him from all the other colleagues who just wanted to torpedo his research, and the setbacks, the resilience coming back from, setbacks and things like that, because patients died doing some of these procedures. And so you learn a lot of these lessons about just perseverance as well as passion and commitment.
Yeah. Now, I could imagine that the adoption of that might have been even harder, right? Because it is now actually have to change the behavior of doctors rather than the behavior of, which drug do I prescribe? But now it's actually, right, sort of a pretty much an art of putting this in, and now I have to do it in a different way. So,
well, the take-up was actually pretty quick after it was proven. It was just getting to that point. And then once his results started getting published in the mainstream journals, and then he would demonstrate it in front of his colleagues, in various laboratories, the take-up was pretty fast because everybody realized this is a much better way of treating this disease than what we'd been doing.
Great. Interesting. Well, I think we need to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about the book, Managing Discovery in the Life Sciences. Rob Burns, we want to thank you very much for joining us for the first half of our show. Phil Ray is going to stick around for the next half, and we'll be joined by the third co-author of this book, Mark Pauly, an economist and professor of healthcare management. I'm your host, Nikolai Zigelko. My co-host is Harbir Singh, and this is Mastering Innovation on Business Radio, powered by the Wharton School on Sirius XM 111. We'll be right back.